Hi, my name is Kevin Doody, and you're watching Doody's Daggers. Today we are going to be talking about 5 commonly asked questions in the knife world. Some of them might be questions you have when you're first starting out getting into the knife world, the big old world that we are in as knife collectors. And some might be questions that you have later on. Doesn't really matter. A couple are more entry-level questions, some are more advanced, and we're going to talk about them. So here we go. Number 1. What does a good sharpening choil look like?
All right, so here on the table I have examples of knives with varying degrees of sharpening choils. Some have great sharpening choils, some have non-existent sharpening choils, some have okay sharpening choils. And I'm going to kind of show you the differences here. Let's start with a pretty good sharpening choil. This is the Vosti Nightshade, and what we're looking at is this area right in here. This is the sharpening choil, this notch cut out of the blade right here. Now, in order to know what a good sharpening choil is, we need to know what a plunge grind is. A plunge grind is where the bevel ends right here, and we go up to the full thickness of the blade stock material. This whole area is ground away, and at some point it has to transition back up to the full thickness of the blade stock, and that happens right in here. You can see that there's a little bit of a slope up, and then we get up to here, and we're at the full thickness. Some plunge grinds are much tighter, like this one. There's barely any slope. It's very, very quick. And some have more gradual ones, like this, where it kind of slowly slopes up and then gets to the full thickness. With a good sharpening choil, it's going to have separation between that plunge grind and the edge termination, which is where our sharpened edge comes and ends. Here we have some pretty good separation. Edge termination is here, and the plunge grind begins to get thick right about here. So that's maybe an 1/8 inch of space there. Now the reason we want space there is because when we're coming in here with the sharpening stones, we want to maintain an even edge bevel all the way back to where it ends. If we have a plunge grind getting in the way where it starts to thicken up here, we're not going to be able to sharpen all the way back to the edge termination. Now here's an example of a smile. You'll hear this term pretty frequently when talking about plunge grinds and sharpening choils. This is an example of a sharpening choil that is almost non-existent. We have our edge termination here, and it ends right as we're starting to thicken up here in the plunge grind. And you can see that we have two parallel lines here, the very edge and then where the edge bevel begins. They're nice and even all the way, and then here they start to get wider. And that's because this material in here is starting to thicken up. And that's what a smile is. We have parallel lines, nice even edge bevel, and then whoop, starts to thicken up right here. It just looks bad. It looks kind of bad. What we like is a nice crisp end of that edge bevel, just like this. It ends nicely, everything's parallel and even, and it looks real nice. Here's an example of no sharpening choil. And this is what we get when the sharpening stone kind of hits in the plunge grind area. You can see this kind of notch that has been taken out here. The sharpening stone came in here, and I was trying to sharpen all the way back to where it ends, but it's too close. So I ended up nicking the plunge grind right there. Now here's an example of a huge sharpening choil. It's so big that it's really just a choke-up spot as well for your finger. But look at our separation between our edge termination and our plunge grind is really big. So technically, as we sharpen away material over the years of owning this knife, we could sharpen it all back. We could sharpen it for years until this much material was gone. All the way back to there. And then we would start having trouble running into the plunge grind. But I don't think anyone would ever own this knife that long, where you would sharpen away that much material. Hope that made sense. I do have a full video dedicated to this if you feel like watching it. I go into a little bit more detail.
Number 2, what are tolerances?
Let's say you're a machinist at Grimsmo, and your job is to mill this hole in the scale that this pivot fits down into. You look on the computer at your plans, and you see there's a circle, and there's a measurement that specifies how big that circle needs to be. Let's say it's 1/4 inch. This is obviously it'd be probably in decimals and all that, but for the purposes of the video, we'll say it's 1/4 inch. Now, machining is not an exact science, and measurements get so crazy small that if we were to try to get this hole exactly 1/4 inch in diameter, we would drive ourselves insane. We would waste a lot of material. We would waste consumables, and it would just be a nightmare. So what machinists need to do is give themselves a little bit of wiggle room in the measurement. They give themselves a tolerance for this measurement, and that means that it's the acceptable amount of variation that they can have in that measurement. So it would look something like this. It would say a 1/4 inch plus or minus 1/8 of an inch, for example. That means that this measurement can be either a 1/4 inch, or it can be 3/8, which is a 1/4 plus 1/8, or it can be a 1/4 minus 1/8, which is 1/8, or it can be anywhere in between. That's acceptable for this part. Now, things that have to fit into other things, maybe the tolerance is going to be a lot smaller because it has to fit in something else. Some things can have a little more wiggle room because maybe they're not fitting right into something else. So that's what a tolerance is. It's the acceptable amount of variation there can be in a measurement. Now, you'll hear a lot of reviewers refer to, or they'll say, this knife has really tight tolerances, and they're referring to, for example, this tight amount of clearance in between the blade and the scale. What they actually mean is that has really tight clearances. Tolerances are what we just talked about. Clearances are the amount of distance in between two objects. For example, like the blade and the scales are really close together. Almost looks like they're touching. So this knife has really tight clearances in this aspect. It also has really tight tolerances, but that's kind of a different thing. This knife is like $30, so it probably doesn't have very tight clearances. You can see there's a lot more of a gap in between the blade and the liners in there. And it's not as well made, so the tolerances are going to be a little bit more lenient, meaning that all these pieces do not fit together as tightly as they could. What makes Grimsmo so awesome is their tolerances are really tight. So all of these pieces fit together really, really well.
Number 3, what is HRC and why does it matter?
HRC stands for Rockwell Hardness C-Scale. Imagine you're out walking your dog and you see a piece of rebar on the ground. Maybe it was left over from a job site. And you see a little piece of, it's rebar, it's made out of metal, and you say, hey, I'm going to make a knife out of that. You take it home, you shape it into a knife, you sharpen it, but it doesn't hold an edge very well because it's a mild steel and it hasn't been hardened. What gives knives the ability to get sharp, get a nice fine edge, and then stay sharp for a pretty long time is because they're made out of a specific steel that can be hardened. Hardening is a very important part of the knife making process, and it's tricky because it needs to be done at very exact temperatures for exact amounts of time, and each blade steel has a different protocol for the heat treating process that is required for that specific blade steel to be nice and hard to its optimal level. Each blade steel has its own parameters of acceptable hardness levels. For example, for MagnaCut, a good Rockwell measurement, a good hardness measurement would be like 64 HRC. For MagnaCut, that is nice and hard. If you go any harder than that, the blade is going to become brittle. So it's a fine line. It's the harder it gets, the more brittle. The softer it gets, the less brittle and tougher it'll be. So there needs to be a balance between both extremes, and each blade steel has an optimal range of that sweet spot. When someone's talking about the HRC of a blade, they say, okay, this knife is in MagnaCut, and the HRC is 60. Well, you're going to think, that's not great because we have found that the optimal range for MagnaCut should be more towards 63, 64. So you might want to avoid that particular knife. But remember, it's different for every blade steel, so M390 might be completely different. I don't have them all memorized. So that's what HRC is basically. It is the hardness of the blade, and how well it's going to hold an edge is a direct result of that hardness.
Number 4, what is stropping and how do I do it?
If you're into knives, you really should be stropping your knives. Basically what stropping is using a piece of leather that's glued down to a piece of wood usually, and you run your edge across it to keep it sharp. Now you might say, that's what sharpening stones are for. Yes. Stropping is basically the first line of defense against a dull knife. If you are regular with your stropping, it'll be a pretty long time before you actually need to go to the sharpening stones to put a new edge on. I strop obsessively. I'm a little probably too obsessed with it, so if I use this knife today, when I get home, I'm going to strop it up so that I'm maintaining that nice sharp edge, and it never gets dull enough to where I need to, put it on the sharpener and use the stones on it. So you should have a strap, and you should use it. Now, in addition to just leather, you also are going to need some kind of stropping compound. You can buy diamond powder and then mix it with water and make your own. This is about 1 micron, and you're going to shake it really well. You're going to spray it on. Usually it's more, but I'm not going to do that much right now. You want to get a good coating. Just kind of maybe spread it around with your finger and then let it dry. Once it's dry, you're going to take your knife. You're always going to go this way. You're never going to take the edge and bite it into the leather, pulling it toward or pushing away from you. You're always dragging. So you're going to want to put your knife on the leather and first put it flat maybe, and then kind of lift up to where you think that edge bevel is going to be. It's obviously not going to be perfectly flat, so you're going to lift it up a little bit. If the edge bevel is really thick, you're probably going to want to lay it down further to the surface of the leather. If it's a very thin edge bevel like on this knife, you're going to want to raise it up a little bit more. And you're going to very gently run it across the strop. You're not putting hardly any downward pressure, you're just letting the weight of the knife drag across. Now, if you're sharpening like a Warncliffe or something, this is going to be a lot easier. Because there's no belly. You literally just, raise it up a little bit, drag it across. Drag it across. But if you have a little belly, you're going to need to kind of rotate your hand to follow along the belly of the blade. So you're going along, you're going to kind of turn all the way up to the tip. Then the other side, still pulling, just like that. You'll get the hang of it. You can't really mess up your edge too badly. It's not stones. It's not taking away that much material at all. So it's not like if you get your angle wrong, you're destroying your tip. It's not going to get sharp if you're at the wrong angle. But with experience, you will be able to really easily be able to guess kind of what angle you need to hold the knife at. Somewhere around 5 strokes per side, depending on how dull the knife is. And you're done. Now, after stropping, if you go and feel the edge and it's still dull, you might be at the point where you need to put it on the sharpening stones and actually put a new edge on. Now, while we're at it, a really good way to test the sharpness of your edge, put your thumb on the spine and put 3 of your fingers very gently, barely touching the edge. You're going to kind of run them up and down, very lightly touching your fingertips to the edge. If it's a sharp edge, you're going to feel it kind of biting into the very top layer of your skin, just barely. If it's dull, you're not going to feel it biting in at all. And if you do that with enough knives, you'll kind of get a feel for a very sharp edge versus, a sort of sharp edge versus a very dull edge.
And number 5, what does thickness behind the edge mean?
You might hear a reviewer talking about a knife, talking about the blade, and you might hear them say, this knife has a thickness behind the edge measurement of 20 thousandths. Or they might say, this knife is 20 thousandths behind the edge. What does that mean? Why does it matter? And what is a good measurement? Well, thickness behind the edge means they're taking a caliper and they're measuring from this point where the shiny part of the edge meets the actual bevel part, not the primary edge, but where it meets the secondary bevel, and they're going from either side and measuring that distance. It'll be kind of easier to get a feel for if you see it drawn out. So we're looking down like this, down at our edge. Here's our sharpened edge, and here's our edge bevel. We take the calipers, and they're measuring this point to this point. So we take our calipers, just like that. It's where the shiny part ends and the dark part begins, is where you want to put your caliper on both sides. Now, if you have a really thick measurement there, the blade might not slice as well. Picture an edge that looks like this. You know, you're trying to pass this through cardboard, and if it's wide enough here, or if it's too wide here, it's just not going to pass through well. You know, thinner objects are going to slide through material easier than thicker objects. If we have the same blade stock, but it's ground thinner, that measurement is going to be less, therefore it's going to slice better. The most common kind of range for the average pocket knife is anywhere from between like 15 to 20 thousandths. Would be pretty okay for an average EDC knife. Some get thicker, like a Hinderer or a Benchmade can get like up in like the 30 thousandths sometimes, which is crazy thick. And then, you know, a nice, really nice thin measurement, which you would see pretty commonly, would be like 10 thousandths, 12 thousandths. Occasionally, if someone is really good at grinding, or maybe it's a more expensive knife, they took more time with it, you know, you can get measurements down to like 4 thousandths, 5 thousandths. I think my Rask is something crazy. Let's see. 6 thousandths, yeah. So it's very, very thin behind the edge. As you take your fingers on both sides and you run them down, it almost feels like it disappears into nothing. If you do the same thing on this knife, you can definitely feel it's kind of like a very defined point where you can feel the edge is ending. This, it just feels like it goes into nothing. Now, that's not the only factor in sliciness. In fact, blade thickness, blade stock thickness, is more important than behind the edge thickness. The easiest way to explain this is think about an axe. If you could sharpen the axe down to a really nice thin measurement behind the edge, but it's still an axe. It's not going to be easy to pass through cardboard. So if you have something with a thinner blade stock, but still average thickness behind the edge, say we have really thin blade stock, but we're still like 20 thousandths, which is kind of a lot, it's still going to slice pretty well because the overall blade is just thinner.
That's it. Hopefully that was helpful. If you like this video, you like this style, give me some more ideas. I'm running out of ideas. I need some. So leave me a comment. Give me some video ideas. Maybe I'll shout you out if I end up making the video you suggested. Thanks for watching. Please like the video, and I'll see you next time.